Hello, wherever you are in the world today, thank you for joining us for The Rise Traveler, unpacking conversations of sustainable travel. We're here to move a step beyond the Instagram-ready world of travel and think critically and deeply about how travel can uplift global communities, protect natural ecosystems, and be a source of growth for travelers. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we are committed to empowering travelers and travel professionals through education. Our programs, research, experiential journeys, scholarships, and free resources are all aimed at bringing you closer to a more responsible and ethical travel experience. Learn more by visiting risetravelinstitute.org.
Hi. Welcome to Rise Travel Institute's podcast, The Rise Traveler, Unpacking Conversations of Sustainable Travel. I'm Vincie Ho, the guest host for Season 4. In this special season, we'll be talking to critical theory scholars and activists and leaders in sustainability and social and environmental justices in the travel and tourism space. And together, we'll delve into the ethics of travel and discuss some of the pressing issues that are impacting communities at travel destinations around the world. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with my good friend, Professor Christopher Gaffney. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
And I'm also excited because we'll be doing a live interview in person for our podcast for the very first time here on the campus of NYU. And so I'm excited for the opportunity. So Chris, a little bit about who our guest is today. Chris is a professor in the Tisch Center for Hospitality in the School of Professional Studies at New York University. A Vermont-born, Texas-trained geographer, he has taught in Taiwan, Brazil, Switzerland, and at several universities in the United States. His earlier work focused on the intersection of urban studies and sports mega events. His 2008 monograph, Temples of the Earthbound Gods, explored the interdigitation of urban development and sporting cultures in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. Chris served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Latin American Geography from 2014 to 2018, guiding the journal's award-winning transformation. He's also appeared in a host of documentary films and is often quoted in the world's leading media outlets. He ran an influential blog in the lead-up to the 2016 Olympics, Hunting White Elephants, and has written extensively on the impacts and realpolitik of sports mega events across numerous formats. Prior to joining NYU in 2018, Chris was the project manager for Team Rubicon's disaster relief efforts in Post-Maria, Puerto Rico. Currently, he is working on 3 streams of research: global tourism risk, regenerative tourism design, and global nomadism. Chris, we're so happy to have you to have you share your story and your expertise with the RISE community today. So to kick off our conversation, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into hospitality, travel, and tourism as a geographer by training?
Well, thanks first of all for having me on the podcast. Pleasure to be here. Greetings to the RISE community out there in podcast land. I was a really passionate football player and wanted to see how people could see if I could get people to pay me to go around the world watch football games. It's nothing more noble than that. And in the late 90s, I was teaching at a boarding school in Connecticut, and I was coaching soccer, teaching Spanish and geography and ESL, and some books started coming out about global football, and there were some guys that just traveled around the world and written about culture and people and places through the lens of football. And they were good books, but I thought that was something I could do too. And so I went and I decided to pursue my master's degree in geography at UMass Amherst, and ended up writing a thesis that was a little bit different than other people had done. It was about the geographic construction of reality through sports. Mm-hmm. So basically how as sport people around the world play the same game in the same spatial container, more or less the field, with the same rules, but you can play 5-a-side in your backyard or in the park, but also play in the World Cup final. It's the same game, the same spatial dynamics, but the scale and the importance and the impact of those games are very different. And so in thinking about how the stadium is the container of those things, and obviously stadiums move so many emotions, so many dollars, so many people, so many non-human objects, and because stadiums have been part of urban cultures since we started having urban cultures, from ancient Rome and Greece and Byzantium to the Aztecs and the Maya and the Chinese and the Persians. Everyone had a stadium of some kind. And so this is kind of a universal human architectural form. And so I started looking at the stadium as an expression of modernity in a way, but also as an expression of what happens when you get people together in cities. And that's when I wrote the book on Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. And when I was in Rio in 2004, they had just been saddled with the 2007 Pan American Games. And so the stadiums I was studying in Rio were about to go major transformation in order to host a mega event, which was in preparation for hosting other mega events. So frequently what cities will do, especially so-called second-tier global cities like Rio, is that they aspire to the Olympics, but they need to prove to the global cabal of the IOC or FIFA that they can host these smaller events. And so they get practice in the legal and political and social and infrastructural contortions that they have to go through in order to host these events. And Rio was just starting to go through that in 2003, 2004 when I was doing my doctoral research. And that was interesting to see then how the stadiums, as kind of the most important sites of these events, are transformed in the image of global capital, which is essentially what a mega event is. And so you take these very historic trajectories of stadiums, that some of them were from the early 20th century, some of them from mid-20th century, in Rio in particular, and then they collide with the demands of the mega event. And so I started looking at that in the context of Rio de Janeiro in particular. And I lived there for 6 years as the Olympic, or first the World Cup, and then the Olympics came to town.
So you've been a critical voice about the impact of mega events such as the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup on local residents that many tourists are not aware of. And by the way, I'll start again because I think that we didn't record the whole part about football and soccer, which is very interesting, I think, for the listeners. So I'm gonna just start again. Okay. How do we transition into that though? So you've been a very critical voice about the impact of mega events such as the and also your chair.
My chair.
Yeah.
I know. I'll stop. I'll try to. I'll sit very still.
Yes, it's still. So you've been a critical voice about the impact of mega events such as the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup on local residents that many tourists are not aware of, such as evictions and displacements, gentrification, money spent on infrastructure that is not serving the locals, arrest of homeless people, and so on and so forth. We're not just talking about the millions of people, like locals and migrants, being displaced in China, for example, that got reported in a lot of news articles, right, during the 2008 Olympics. But even in Japan, some folks got displaced 2 times, not only just for the previous summer Olympics, but also for the 1964 ones. I know that you were in Brazil in 2014 and 2016 when they hosted the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. Tell us a little bit about how these games were received by the locals, the residents, and what happened on the ground.
Yeah, that's a long and complicated story, and I guess I would start by saying that when I first moved to Brazil in 2009, I became part of an anti-Olympics group called the Comitê Social do Plan, which is the social committee of the Pan American Games, which had formed in order to resist the projects from the Pan American Games. That was still active in 2009, even though the games were in 2007. And on the eve of the announcement of the Olympic host, we went down to Copacabana, and there were about 300,000 people on Copacabana Beach with a big screen set up ready for a party. And there were I think 13 of us with protest signs and pamphlets. And so we were 13 against 300,000. And and there was a huge party when Rio was announced as the host. And so everyone was excited. It was a national celebration, really. And it's one of these things where the subaltern nations, the peripheral nations, think that this is a sign that they have arrived on the global stage. And so it's a geopolitical thing. Lula was really pushing for it. He was guaranteeing all financial coverage, everything that the IOC wanted. Brazil was going to give more. And this was also an opportunity for Brazil, and Brazil is one of the BRICS in the post-financial crisis moment, was doing pretty well. And so Brazil was really showing global leadership, and so they thought this was a real affirmation of their place in the global elite, or whatever you want to call it. Pre-Bolsonaro, of course, and then we know what's happened since then. And so people were excited, and I think it really comes down to class lines. If you 5 years later, or actually 4 years later, in 2013, we saw massive protests against World Cup spending in Brazil erupted all over Brazil in the summer of 2013, on the eve of the Confederations Cup, an unprecedented national scale protest as a FIFA event was going on. And so in 4 years, the mood soured very quickly. And then Brazil lost 7-1 to Germany. And then Dilma was impeached. And then Bolsonaro gets elected. Right? And so you have this real quick turnaround. And so the only people who, at the end, were in favor of the Olympics and World Cup were the upper middle class and upper class of Brazil, because they've already won. There's nothing for them to lose. They got the contracts. They like the gentrified stadiums. Their property values went up. They could sell their second apartment. They didn't have to move. Their streets were more securitized for them. Better restaurants came in. They had better metro access to the southern beaches. And so the event was by and for and through the Brazilian elite and so it made a lot of sense for them. But for everybody else, they couldn't afford to go to the games. They have been priced out of the stadiums now in the post-World Cup and Olympic moment. And Rio is a much more dangerous and less vibrant city than it was 15 years ago. And so it's been a real disaster. And I guess I would say relative to that, most tourists don't know about it. There's a lot of information about Brazil ahead of the games because Western media is what people tend to listen to. And when Western media goes to a place like Brazil, they're keen to say, oh, well, look, the Brazilians are late, or they're overpriced, or they're violent, or their pollution things haven't been sorted out, they're evicting people. And then it gets spread very quickly in Western media sources. But we don't see the same kind of scrutiny happening in Paris, for example, by the New York Times, or the Washington Post, or the LA Times, or the Guardian, or the Times of London, or El País, or Corriere della Sera. They're not going to Paris with the same critical eye that they went to Rio, or to China, or to Azerbaijan for the European Games. So there's an inherent colonialist bias in the way that these events are not only produced but consumed by Western tourists.
No, you're absolutely right. When I was talking about the problems caused by the Beijing Olympics, it was heavily mediatized, right? Whereas, as you said, like this time around, we hear a lot about what's going on currently with the protest in Paris, but mostly capitalizing on the occasion, like the Olympics around the corner, to actually, I mean, it's more political, like about local politics because of the presidential elections coming up, but not really protest against the Olympics per se, right? Because as you said,
but there are many protests in Paris against the Olympics and evictions and things.
Right.
And anti-gentrification protests and against noise, pollution, construction, affordability.
And so on. Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of other protests, I think, they're quite strategic. Because you have this big pot of money sitting. The French government is obliged to deliver certain things by a certain date. And if you can leverage that as a union or as a syndicate, garbage workers, etc., we're going on strike during the Olympics unless you agree to our conditions, and then you have to, because you can't have garbage workers on strike during the Olympics.
Exactly.
And so this is a strategic leveraging point. But if you and then just to finish that point, it's also the construction firms that do this to even greater effect, because they have to deliver major infrastructure projects on time.
That's right.
And they can delay and delay and delay and say, oops, well, in order to get this delivered on time, we need 3 shifts to get it done, and that's going to require a lot more money, and then the government has no option but to pay.
Absolutely.
And that's billions versus the millions that the garbage workers would get.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're talking about, like, all these strategic protests that have been happening, and one of the very famous one that has been talked about, like, in the past 2 weeks is the protest about the pollution in the River Seine. So yeah, and also, as you said, like, over time, people are more aware, like residents are more aware of, like, the power of their voice, like taking to the street and protest against, because they're more aware of the impact of, especially of gentrification, even for those who don't get, like, physically evicted because of the construction of the Olympic Village and infrastructure towards and from the village. And friends friends of mine who live in Paris, like, most of them have been boycotting mega events, like, such as the previous FIFA World Cup in Qatar, for example. Like, even the craziest football fans that I have in my circle, none of them watched it. And so I think they now, like, realize the power of, like, not participating in these sporting events, like, in their own ways. And so I am wondering, like, looking ahead, about these Olympic Games in Paris. It seems like there's a lot of greenwashing going on, and also about the Qatar Games, like the FIFA World Cup in 2022. Apparently, again, as I just said, like, a minute ago, people now realize that there are countries with alarming human rights violation records actually win these bids, to host these important games. What do you think about what we could do as, like, ordinary people, like, in face of this kind of trends, like, or, like, in in 2026? The U.S., Mexico, and Canada are going to host the FIFA World Cup, and the U.S. has gross human rights violations too.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And so, like, what should we do or not do in terms of, like, what can I do, for example, like?
Well, I think there are a couple ways to think about it. One is that these events are optional. There's we didn't have the Olympic Games in 2020, and no one missed it, as far as I can tell.
That's right.
No one missed it at all. We were too preoccupied with staying alive and figuring out what was going on with COVID. But no one actually cares about the Olympics, is my belief. And I think that the Olympics are very fragile because it's a belief system. It's an ideology that has to be continually renovated. And the Olympics are scared shitless that they don't have enough cities to bid for their events. And so this is why we ended up in a situation where we only had Paris and Los Angeles bidding for the games. And Los Angeles was a last-minute bid because Boston managed a very strong anti-Olympic movement and canceled the Boston bid. And so it was really just 2 cities for 2 Olympics, and the IOC said, okay, you take this one, you take that one, and then Brisbane will give you it as long as you put your hand up. And so there is such a strong movement against the Olympics and standing anti-Olympic committees in major cities that it's a supply issue for the Olympics. And the less that people pay attention to it, the more fragile it becomes. And so it is a political choice, but it's also a moral choice to turn away from something that you find repugnant. And if you don't find the Olympics repugnant, we can sit down and talk about that for a million days about Larry Nassar and abuse and sexual abuse of athletes and doping and the scandals and the absolutely vile people that are behind every aspect of the Olympics. And then for maybe some of the more progressive listeners on the podcast, if you think about, if you ask yourself a question whether or not you're going to watch the Olympics, is do we need more nationalist fervor right now? And if your answer is yes, then okay, well then you're pretty happy with the French elections, or you like the recent Supreme Court rulings, then maybe this podcast is not for you. But if the answer is no, that we don't need more nationalist fervor, then you think about, what is the Olympics all about? It's about waving flags and the conquest of rare metals. It's like a mining exercise for geopolitical rivals. Who gets the most gold?
Absolutely.
Who gets the most silver? And so it is a colonialist project, not only of the body, but of the planet. And so the Olympics is colonialism. And Olympic tourism is colonialism. And because cities are produced for consumption of the tourist. And it's a global elite, it's an elite event, so it's absolutely one of the most despicable, horrible human practices, and it has to be abolished, in my opinion. And we should never, ever, as well-thought, caring individuals who care anything about the world, animal welfare, human welfare, environmental welfare, political, social, cultural, you should never, ever watch the Olympics or give that any of your attention again.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. That's a very strong message. I appreciate it. I really appreciate it, because I will have to be honest that maybe because we are like working with very like-minded people who like we tend to attract individuals who are more on the progressive side of the political spectrum, and I believe that the RISE community is pretty much of that makeup in our follower or listener demographic. However, I also know that the reality is the mainstream messaging of the Olympics, like, fostering peace, bringing people together, being the leader in sustainability and all these things that people actually do buy into and believe, and also like with the rise of authoritarianism worldwide, nationalism is really the last thing that we need right now. But then like these Olympic Games and these mega events are fueling like this kind of ideology.
It fuels everything. It is. I mean, if you think about because the Olympics have to be, and everything is in scare quotes, have to be planned at least 7 years in advance. It's kind of a window into what the future will be like. So I don't know anything about 2028, but I know the Olympics are going to happen in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And we can already see the displacement, the militarization, the financialization of urban territories, the displacements, the infrastructure development, the rerouting the reconfiguration of urban space for spectacle and consumption. That's already happening. We don't have, and then we're the idiots who ask every time, well, is it greenwashing? Well, of course it's greenwashing. And we look at the Olympic sponsors, it's the worst violators of the environment historically.
Yeah.
And so it is designed to be greenwashing, and we're the fools for asking the same question all the time. And when the Olympics, so it's greenwashing, it's human washing, it's peace washing. So if we look at the budgets for security for the Olympics, how is spending billions of dollars, minimum $2 billion, $3 billion on security technology, surveillance technology, how is that suited for peace? And if it's and the reality is that the threat is not terrorism. The threat is the local population. So the threat to the Paris Games is not ISIS or Boko Haram or anyone else. It is the Parisian people saying, "Now wait, hold on." And so all those security mechanisms are to keep the population controlled or at home. And then once the games have gone, those security mechanisms do not go away. They're maintained on that very population. And so you have this securitization combined with infrastructure development to maximize values for some, and then geographic expansion into the Saint-Denis area, gentrification opening up a new vector of residential bliss for the Parisian middle class, who have been priced out of the center of the city, and now they need to occupy the banlieues, which are more proximate. Anyway, it's just disgusting on all levels, and then it's sold to us as this great celebration of humanity.
Yeah.
But
it is. This conversation is really, really enlightening and inspiring, and I have to unfortunately guarantee you that this is not the kind of conversation that a lot of people or most people would be having about the Olympics, because like 9 out of 10 of the people around us, they are excited about the Olympics coming up, like talking about the mascot, like what does it even look like? I have no idea. Isn't it 2FL or something?
I think. I don't know. It's probably
Anyway, so yeah, like
it's probably a robot.
Even the most well-meaning citizens, or like world citizens, they don't really see. I mean, they don't get to hear this kind of conversation. So yeah.
Well, because it's antithetical to things we're told as kids, and the things that we loved as kids, or the Olympics, and sitting around and listening to Bob Costas tell us some stupid fact about some person who rode on their horse for 3 weeks to get to the Olympic training site. And then, who cares? There's so many more other important things in the world, and that the more we pay attention to that drivel, I mean, just accept, if you're going to do it, fine, but accept it as a political choice, that you are choosing to support a form of colonial fascism with all the symbols, and the Olympics are fascist. Let's not mistake any two ways about this. The Nazis invented the torch relay, and all the symbols and such come from a fascist past of the late 19th century French, and so and it's militaristic as well. Shooting events, archery, fencing, so I don't know. There's no excuse for it anymore. We won't miss it if it's gone. If you're going and you like to watch it, good for you, but you're making the world worse by doing it.
Even just by watching.
Just by watching, you're giving it your attention. Yeah, and you're making
and
it.
all the money that's pouring in like this to fuel this capitalistic endeavor. So what? Okay, so what about just an ordinary tourist who is now going to Paris? What would your advice be to this tourist who's like leaving in a week's time to go to see these games because they got a ticket? Like, what?
Yeah. Well, I guess my advice would be to be considerate about where you're putting your money, because Paris is highly dependent on tourist dollars, and one of the major effects of the Olympics always is what we call touristic displacement, or the displacement effect. Whereas in a normal July, Paris would receive, say, 5 million tourists.
Which is already
way too many. But France receives more tourists than any country in the world.
Yeah.
International. But in an Olympic year, it might only receive 3 million tourists. And those tourists will direct their money into the Olympic system and not into the rest of the economy as it ordinarily would be. And so underground tours, or different kinds of restaurants, or other events, theater, shows, performances, all of those things. And this happened in London in 2012, where the theater district almost died completely during the Olympics, because there was this substitution of ordinary, quote-unquote, tourists with Olympic tourists. And the Olympic tourists spent all their money on the Olympics and nothing on the theater, because it's one spectacle replacing another. And so I would be very also conscious of of how the city has been produced for you to consume it, and passively, and everything be kind of organized for your pleasure. So the transportation will be easy in Paris, because the schools will have been closed, the banks will have been closed, the government will have been closed. People will be kind of forcibly put on holiday. So you substitute the normal Parisian flows with Olympic tourist flows, and it makes it seem like everything's working perfectly well. But it's actually, so you're gonna not see more than you will see as a tourist going to Paris for the Olympics.
I love what you just said because you're basically talking about how the city is redesigned for this purpose, and so tourists are not aware of like how the locals usually live, right? And also now we're talking about redesigning cities for the consumption of Olympics tourists, and like totally at the expense of the residents.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, well, literal and expense in multiple ways because this is all public financing, right?
That's right.
And all private benefit, and
Mhm.
so you aren't able to run your normal life. And so, okay, if you're an upper middle class Parisian, you can rent out your flat on Airbnb. But if you're lower class living in the banlieue and now you can't go to work, you because your business has been closed for the Olympics, you've paid with your taxes, you paid with the inconvenience of construction, you're going to be policed, and you're losing your salary, and you have this annoyance for 6 weeks. Because it's not just the Olympics, it's also the Paralympics. Let's not forget that there's the Paralympics that come after.
Yeah.
And so it's...
And the aftermath, and yeah. Years leading to the Olympics and the aftermath.
Yeah, and you've basically captured a generation of urban planning, and so your city has been transformed in the service of this event, and all other alternatives have been shoved off the table because after this Paris will say, oh, we're broke, we just spent all our money on the Olympics.
Right.
And the IOC will be like, all right, well, we're off to Los Angeles, thanks very much for the baguettes, and now we're going to go have pizza in LA or whatever. I don't know. It's just... That's what they did in Rio. They said, thanks very much, see you later, ciao. And then all the Rio organizers went to jail. And let's also remember that the corruption of getting these bids, and I mean, it is just so systemic and so just part of the culture that it's indefensible as a practice if you have a conscious about where we should be going in the world.
Right. Yeah. I'm just curious about like all these Olympic villages. Like they always say that they would repurpose them into something useful after the events. Like, what is the normal fate of these infrastructure, like of the facilities?
The normal fate is that they are either privatized or they're subsidized with public money. For instance, the Olympic Village in Brazil was subsidized with 2.3 billion reais, which is at the time about 700 million US. And then it's subsidized, so there's no risk on the part of the developers. They were basically given all this money to develop it, and then they can sell the apartments on the open market afterwards and recoup their money. In London, it was built by the state and then given to a private developer to operate, and then the 20% of the flats were going to be sold at discounted rates, but the discount was 20% of market price. So it was still 350,000, 400,000 pounds for a 2-bedroom flat in East London, well beyond working class means. And so it's always the same. I mean, there's no, when you think about who is developing the Olympics, it is real estate developers, media, the sports industry, transportation, politicians, tourism, hotels, etc. So they have a large group of vested interests, and those vested interests are obviously not coming from below. They are already they're not for the popular, right? They are for themselves and their constituency, which are the upper middle class and elites. And so why would they it's just not even on their radar. And when you see interviews with people who are trying to sell this project to the lower class Parisians are like, look, you just ruined my neighborhood. I can't go anywhere. It's been noisy here for 7 years. And now you're telling me I'm going to go enjoy the games, and you're going to give me a ticket to a fencing competition? It's like this is the level of grotesquerie that the Olympic family, quote unquote, gets up to, and it's really, I don't know. I'll say it again. The abolition is really the only way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm just really hoping that people within our community and actually beyond our community would get to hear this conversation because yeah, once again, I bet my family and my friends, they're all like, getting ready for the Olympics, and they're already talking about it, excited about it, and like not really being aware of all these like multiple realities that are happening around
Yeah.
this type of events.
And I guess I understand. I mean, I'm a football fan, so I understand why people get excited about some things, but each and every one of these sports already has an international championship every year. Every year. This is just one event, one mega event that brings all these international championships together in 3 weeks in one city with all of these promises of transformation, but they're and we're
Transformation for the world.
for the world. Yeah, they are transforming things. There's no doubt, but they're also making incredible money. And if you think of the IOC as an octopus that has these tentacles always somewhere, and those tentacles are extracting value and transforming space. But they're transforming space to extract value simultaneously. And it's all going back to the mouth of the IOC in Lausanne or to their institutional partners. And so the IOC, NYU is actually much wealthier than the IOC in terms of endowment. It's probably 6 times as wealthy.
Wow.
So the NYU's endowment is 6 times that of the IOC. But the IOC only has 103 members. And they have incredible power. And so there are only a very few people in the world who could meet with Putin, Xi, and Biden and Lula in the same week. And that's the head of the IOC and the head of FIFA and maybe the Pope.
That's a very, very powerful octopus. Well, you just compared another octopus with ours.
Yeah, a lot of octopuses out there. Yeah, let's hope they don't have little octopus babies. And
okay, so this may be a little bit, well, not exactly as relevant, but I'm just trying to help our listeners unpack. What about all the events that may not be as big? We're not talking about mega events, but like important festivals at tourism destinations. Should they go or not go, or refrain from going when they're like, really important like religious or cultural festivals? Because oftentimes like tourists want to be a part of it. I want to go see this. Like they want to be a part of it. They want to experience culture, and there's nothing wrong about that.
Sure.
But we also know the impact of over-tourism and all these things. What is your advice for them?
Yeah, let's just say don't feel bad about your choice, but realize it is a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so fascinating conversation. I think we don't have a lot of time left. We've been chatting for almost an hour already. Just wanted to make sure that we have a couple minutes to talk a little bit about your current projects. So what are some latest projects that you've been working on? And I'm specifically interested in this risk index project. Can you tell us a little bit more about the concept? What do you want to achieve with the project? Who can benefit from the data and analysis? And how many countries have you surveyed so far? And who do you want to work with on this project?
Well, that's a lot of questions. But I will do my best. So coming out of, in 2018, over-tourism became, or Skift decided to, one of their coining terms, over-tourism. And then 2 years later, boom, pandemic. Under-tourism, all of a sudden. And it occurred to me that over-tourism was not a thing. It's a composite condition that is different in every place. So over-tourism, even in Italy, over-tourism in Rome is different than over-tourism in Venice. And so I started looking at the ways in which we could measure the impacts of tourism, not to people or investments, but to places. And so, and this is essentially what over-tourism is saying, is that places are suffering from tourism. But it's not enough to say, oh, you're over-touristed. Like, well, how are we over-touristed? Where is it coming from? And what are the drivers of this? And so the tourism risk, or it's the risk index from tourism, the global risk index from tourism, is looking at the risk exposure of places and communities from tourism as they are now. And so if tourism is to increase in a place, you could say, okay, well, we have high risk in the social context and the environmental context. But economically, tourism is only 3% of total receipts, and so if it stops all of a sudden, then we're probably going to be okay. Whereas a place like Croatia, which has 20% of total receipts dependent on tourism, they're at extreme risk from tourism stopping, or tourism even growing more and getting more of an more influential over politics, over urban space, over resource use. And so the global risk index from tourism looks at the vulnerability of communities that are hosting tourists and what could happen to those communities if tourism continues to grow.
Right. And so governments can definitely benefit from the insight of this project.
Yeah. Well, the idea is to look at it at multiple scales, and so we can look at it at a global scale, and so we have looking at through the lens of risk in 4 pillars of analysis: political, economic, social, and environmental. And if you look at the national level, globally, global data or national data at a global level, then we start to see patterns emerge. The Caribbean and South Pacific Islands are the most at risk, both environmentally and economically, because they're most dependent, but also politically. And so if we think about the political risk of the Dominican Republic relative to its major source markets, Canada and the US, they are always going to need a visa to go to Canada and the US, but never the other way around. So we consider this a political risk that is contingent, that tourism exacerbates. Also, and then when we start looking at a subnational level, we could start thinking about politics and the influence of lobbyists in influencing policy. And so that's a risk of corruption from and through tourism. And so we look at a subnational level, then we can look at a regional level, and then we can go down to the level of a piazza in Rome and interview people about what they perceive to be the risks from tourism. And then to be able to connect that piazza with the city, with the region, with the regional dynamics in a country, and then regional, a geo-regional level like Southern Europe, and then to connect that to a global level is a way of multi-scalar analysis that hasn't really been done before. And we just maintain the same question at all these scales, and we get different answers. And those different answers, well, I guess we get different questions. So the same lens brings us different questions, and those different questions bring different people around the table. And ideally, we can generate conversations that link those levels of analysis so that there can be some policy throughputs that influence or that help to mitigate those risks.
Right. Yeah, and you're right that like questions should be place-based too, right? Like,
questions have to be place-based. Who's capable?
They are super contextualized, right? And so, can you share like some of the countries that you already have been like,
Well, we've done all of them.
All of them?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean like 195?
Well, we got data so we do this macro level analysis, and so we do all the countries for the passport index, for example.
Yeah.
And we compile as much data as we can from as many countries as we can. So it's an index of indices at this macro level.
Okay.
And then we'll start doing a case study in Italy, and then one in Rome, and then neighborhoods of Rome, and then streets of Rome, and then very micro level.
Yeah.
And so going from the micro to the macro.
Right.
And so anyone out there that's looking for
sounds like a huge project.
It's a huge project. Yeah. It's a huge project.
Because you're talking about all these levels, and like to the micro level, you're talking about informants, like interviewing the local people, like the residents of
exactly.
places,
because one of one of the main questions that I'm trying to answer or to try to sort through is, if we have this objective, quantitative, macro level data, that tells us something, but it doesn't tell us how people feel about anything, or how they're going to react, or if they perceive those macro level risks as impinging upon their life. And so in order to have any meaningful movement in the mitigation of these risks, we need to make sure that the subjective perception of risk matches the objective perception, and to have those harmonized through conversation. And I have no solutions. I'm just using this analytical tool to ask questions at multiple scales, and that at each scale a different stakeholder will come into a conversation, and that hopefully we can have a nice mix of questions and people that are working to inform
instituents to better mitigate.
Yeah, practical outcomes of some kind. And then the thing that I think is the second part of this is a new, I'm calling it the rebirth of hospitality, where instead of talking about, so not talking about sustainability, that's the first time I mentioned sustainability in an hour.
Well, the term sustainability is pretty co-opted.
So for me, it lost its meaning. And you say to business people, like, sustainable, it's an option, right? It costs us money, etc. And so I frame tourism risk as a lens, because that's one thing people really understand. Risk.
And people care about.
And care about it.
It's like, oh.
Well, most people, they care about the reward, especially in tourism. People care about the reward, right? And so all tourism studies have focused on the risk to investments, or the risk to individuals. And so tourists get rewards by traveling somewhere. So you're not going to risk your life to go backpack across Somalia. Or maybe you will, and then you can write an article for Vice, and they'll pay you $50, and you can pat yourself on the back for surviving. But if you talk about risk to people and places, then that's like, oh yeah, we're at risk from this. It's not just about getting the tourists and getting the money, but what are we sacrificing to do that? And when you frame it like that, then people pay attention. But then they also have to have a guiding principle for dealing with it, and not just making it less bad, because that's not a motivating thing either. People want to be hopeful about something. And so I'm working through the idea, and this is one of the things we did in this Hospitality 3.0 book, which we'll put a link on the podcast, I hope.
Yeah, because it is a podcast interview, so people...
Yeah, you're going to see it. All right, well, I'm holding it up to a camera anyway, but we'll put a link in there, the Hospitality 3.0 framework.
Yeah, we'll eventually have the video up on our YouTube.
Yeah. And so centering hospitality as a new, or reimagining hospitality as relational and not a commodity.
I love that.
And so typically, as tourists, we go someplace and we buy the experience, essentially. We go to a hotel. Everything's transactional, 100%. And there's no responsibility put on the guest. And traditionally in human cultures, hospitality is an obligation, but the guest also has responsibilities. And so we have an obligation and responsibility that is so far out of balance right now, especially in tourism, that it needs to be addressed. And that's hopeful, because it does make demands on the other. And then then we shift our perspective a little bit and think of ourselves as guests on the planet, which we are, then we need to be better guests to our host. And we need to allow other beings to thrive. The waters to be clean, the fish to live, the porcupines to roam through the forest.
Those who are listening, you now know why we invited Christopher Gaffney on this podcast, and what, like, the rationale behind, this invitation for the Rise Travel Institute's podcast. Because
so I guess the first step towards decolonial travel is understanding that colonialism is not just in the past, but it's something that's ongoing. It's something that we are implicit in. Just sitting here in this office, I'm implicit in all kinds of colonial relations of commodities and rare minerals and privilege, and that we have to recognize colonialism as ongoing and pervasive, and really ensure that what we're doing is not exacerbating it as much as possible. Even though taking a trip to Guatemala, just even having the thought might be a colonial thought, because people in Guatemala are struggling to come to New York, right? And if they survive the hell of crossing the border, getting through Mexico, and all the borders they have to go through to get here, then they're the fortunate ones. But just to have a powerful passport and the means of getting on an airplane is colonial. And so
who gets to decide why our passports are more powerful than other people's passports, right? And this is, intrinsically colonial.
Right.
Sure.
And you were lucky to be born in the where you were, probably. So
British Hong Kong.
Yeah. Vermont. Vermont in 1970.
Right.
But Vermont maybe in 2090 will be very different. So who knows what colonial powers await us in the future. But that decolonizing travel is almost impossible because the act of travel is a colonial act, and so it's a difficult proposition to put out there, but it has to be put out there as kind of the most ambitious place we could take it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it. One last question before you go. What legacy do you want to leave behind?
God, I don't know.
Well,
just some.
I'm not saying that. I'm just like trying to, or maybe for every guest that comes on our podcast, we try to like kind of imagine a world like in like 50 years down the road, for example, and like what kind of footprints do you want to leave on this planet?
Well, footprints. I already left a big electronic footprint.
Right.
I left a big carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but hopefully to have people just remember me as a kind and wise and caring person. That's enough.
Well, I am sure that is going to happen. At least you have me remembering you as exactly how you described yourself. So, well, thank you so much, Chris, for speaking with me today and for sharing your wisdom with our listeners. That brings us to the end of our journey today. If you like what we heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, and comment. Now we talked about social media, ironically. But, if you want to support our work, that would be something that you could do. Follow us at Rise Travel Institute on Facebook and Instagram, and just like really regularly checking out our website and see what new initiatives we are putting in place. Here at the Rise Travel Institute, we believe that travel could be a powerful tool for positive and transformative change if you think more critically and deeply about your impact and your relationship to the world. If you're a college student planning on a study abroad trip, a professional thinking about that gap year or sabbatical, or anyone who's currently traveling the world and working in tourism industry and wants to understand how to travel in a more sustainable and a more decolonial way, we do encourage you to head to risetravelinstitute.org for more information on our educational resources. And so we'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep roaming, keep learning, and continue to be a Rise Traveler. And we're done.
Cool.
That brings us to the end of our journey today. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can follow us at Rise Travel Institute on Facebook and Instagram. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we believe conscious travel can help us create a more just and equitable world. If you are a college student planning a study abroad trip, a tourism professional who wants to create a more equitable and inclusive industry, or anyone who is currently traveling the world and wants to understand how to travel in a just and sustainable way, we do encourage you to head to risetravelinstitute.org for more information on our educational programs. We will be back soon with another episode, and until then, keep roaming, keep learning, and continue to be a Rise Traveler.